January 1942. Somewhere west of Moscow. Temperature, minus 38 degrees Celsius. Wind slicing across the open Russian steppe like broken glass. A horizon of white, stretching endlessly into a sky the color of steel. Inside a German Panzer III, Obergefreiter Heinrich Langer exhaled, and the moisture from his breath froze instantly on the inside of his goggles. The heater had failed hours ago, if one could even call the tiny petrol-fired device a heater. Outside, the world was a frozen graveyard of abandoned equipment, shattered wheels, cracked fuel lines, and silent engines locked solid by the cold. Inside the tank it wasn't much better. The metal walls radiated cold like a tomb. The crew's uniforms were stiff with ice. Leather belts had frozen into rigid shapes. Oil in the recoil cylinder had turned to sludge. Grease in the traverse gear had become thick as cement. By dawn, one of Langer's loaders, 19-year-old Gunther, could no longer feel his feet. At first, he thought they were numb. By mid-morning, they were blue, and he wasn't the only one. Across the front, thousands of German tankers were discovering the same terrible truth. Machines built for Western Europe were dying on the Eastern Front, and their crews were dying with them. The German army had advanced faster than any force in modern history. From June to December 1941, the Wehrmacht had driven nearly 500 miles into the Soviet Union, smashing. The wind on the Don River steppe could flay the skin from a man's face. In January 1943, that wind howled across a frozen landscape where an entire army was dying in silence. It was the coldest winter Europe had seen in generations. Temperatures below 40 degrees Celsius. Snow crusted over corpses, rifles frozen to dead hands. In the middle of that white wilderness, 1,000 German soldiers from the 3rd Battalion, 376th Infantry Regiment marched east and were never seen again. Their disappearance was first recorded in a single line of a divisional report. Contact with 3/376 lost, 19th January 1943, assumed encircled. Nothing more. No coordinates. No radio logs, no survivors. For months, nobody could explain how an entire battalion could simply vanish. Only when the snow melted that spring did Soviet patrols stumble upon what remained, a ghostly tableau of war suspended in ice. To understand how those men vanished, we must return to the dying days of the Battle of Stalingrad. By late 1942, the German 6th Army was trapped. Field Marshal Paulus's divisions were encircled by the Red Army in a pocket stretching from Kalach to the Volga. Inside that ring, 250,000 men fought starvation, disease, and temperatures that cracked engine blocks. But the disaster at Stalingrad was only part of a much larger collapse. Divisions, capturing cities, and encircling entire armies. Hitler's generals believed the Red Army was finished. Berlin broadcast triumph. Europe held its breath. But no one, not even the most experienced veterans of the First World War, understood what awaited them beyond Smolensk, Vyazma, and Klin. In late November, a Siberian cold front descended onto the German lines. Temperatures plummeted below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Weapons jammed, lubricants froze, engines seized, fuel thickened like jelly, steel became brittle enough to crack. German tanks, Panzer IIIs, IVs, and Czech-built 38s were never designed for this. Their engines relied on lubricants optimized for temperate climates. Their water pumps froze. Their radiators burst. Their batteries died. The cold stripped away every advantage the panzer divisions had used to dominate Europe. And the soldiers? They suffered even more. Most German tankers still wore light wool uniforms. Gloves were scarce. Proper winter boots were non-existent. Blankets were thin. The myth of German invincibility began to freeze and fracture, literally overnight. German armor doctrine had never been meant for static winter combat. The Panzerwaffe depended on mobility, fast breakthroughs, and rapid exploitation of gaps in enemy lines. Their vehicles reflected that doctrine. Thin armor, agile chassis, engines tuned for speed over resilience. Against Soviet tanks like the T-34 and KF-1, the Germans already struggled. But in extreme cold, something worse happened. The environment itself became a weapon. Oil solidified, fuel wouldn't ignite. Gearboxes froze, tracks cracked from thermal stress. Optics fogged the moment a tanker breathed near them, and inside the crew compartment, men shivered uncontrollably. Some had to share body heat just to remain conscious. This was not the blitzkrieg the tankers had trained for. This was survival against an enemy no amount of doctrine could overcome. At minus 30 degrees Celsius, even Soviet engines struggled, but the Red Army had prepared for winter warfare. Many Soviet tanks were started by heating the engine block with small fires built underneath. The Germans had none of these luxuries. To start a Panzer III in Russian winter required burning fuel-soaked rags under the engine block for 20 to 30 minutes, having multiple crewmen pump the starter while praying the battery still had charge. Sometimes, even after hours of effort, the tank wouldn't start at all. So crews slept inside their tanks, because if the engine died overnight, it might never come back to life. But sleeping in a frozen metal coffin was hardly rest. The cold seeped into bone. Condensation froze on eyelashes, eyebrows, and beards. Men awoke shaking violently, unable to unclench their hands. Those who slept outside fared even worse. Tank interiors were supposed to be cramped and hot. In Russia's winter, they were cramped and deadly. Frostbite claimed fingers first, trigger fingers, loader's fingers, the hands that fed shells into breaches. When sensation vanished, so did combat effectiveness. One tank commander wrote, "I feared the cold more than the Russians. A shell kills instantly, but the cold kills slowly, inch by inch." Feet were next. Boots froze to metal floors. Socks turned stiff. Toes blackened. If the tank was hit and the crew had to escape, many could barely walk. Some never made it out. Cold did not discriminate. It took veterans and replacements alike. By mid-December 1941, German logistics officers began reporting strange mechanical failures. Fuel that refused to ignite even with forced air injectors. Machine guns that jammed after only a few rounds. Turrets that needed 2 men to traverse radios whose wires snapped when, bent optics cracking from temperature shock, even lubricants specially designed for low temperatures froze solid. One Panzer battalion reported that only 8 out of 54 tanks were operational on a given day. Not because of enemy action, but because of the cold. And the Red Army knew it. Soviet counterattacks targeted immobilized German armor, overrunning tanks whose crews could barely operate their controls. It was said that many German units were defeated not by bullets, but by thermometers. As the Soviet winter offensive began in December 1941, the Germans were pushed backward along the entire front. Tank crews often had no choice but to abandon their vehicles, frozen solid and impossible to start under fire. Across the snow, hundreds of panzer holes stood like dark, silent monuments. Turrets stuck mid-rotation. Tracks snapped. Hatches frosted shut. Guns iced over crew positions, empty except for frozen equipment. Some tanks were so cold inside that food left on the turret floor froze harder than ice. Water bottles shattered. Coffee became blocks of brown ice. Bread had to be chopped with knives. And still, many tankers stayed with their machines because they knew survival outside was even less likely. They were trapped between two killers, the Soviet Army and the Russian winter. The cold did more than freeze flesh and metal. It froze morale. Tank crews reported hallucinations, slow thinking, disorientation, symptoms of hypothermia creeping in while they tried to maintain combat readiness. Orders became difficult to understand. Reloading took twice as long. Drivers steered sluggishly, their hands numb and shaking. Commanders struggled to stay awake, their bodies exhausted from constant shivering. One German diary entry reads, "We were no longer soldiers. We were animals trying not to freeze to death inside iron cages." And yet, despite the cold, frostbite, immobilization, and exhaustion, they kept fighting. Some out of duty, some out of fear, some because their frozen tanks were the only shelter they had. But all knew the same cruel truth. No survives long on the Eastern Front after leaving their tank. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched its first major counteroffensive since the start of Operation Barbarossa. Siberian divisions, fresh, rested, and equipped for winter warfare, arrived in perfect timing with the cold. They came wearing thick white camouflage suits, felt-lined boots, padded gloves, and fur caps. German reconnaissance reported something eerie. The Soviets moved like ghosts across the snow, while German soldiers struggled just to keep their limbs from freezing. Tank battles that summer had been contests of speed and maneuver. Now they were duels between machines that could barely function, and others built precisely for this climate. Soviet T-34s roared to life with engines warmed by charcoal braziers. Their diesel fuel flowed like water, unaffected by the cold. Their wide tracks glided across ice and snow. Their crews, wrapped in fur, could sit for hours without losing sensation. Against this, the German tankers fought at a deadly disadvantage. Some German units reported that even when they did manage to start their tanks, the engines had to run constantly to stay warm, burning precious fuel they could not replace, and the Soviets attacked exactly when the Germans were weakest. Everything the panzer divisions relied upon, momentum, coordination, speed, collapsed in the winter air. Orders jammed in radios with frozen components. Artillery support arrived hours late because horses died in the cold. Infantry could not keep pace with tanks, many of which no longer moved anyway. The German advantage in training, discipline, and combined arms coordination evaporated as cold gnawed away at every moving part of their machine. A battalion commander in the 7th Panzer Division wrote, "We no longer executed maneuvers. We simply tried to survive long enough to receive more fuel." In the summer, German tanks devoured kilometers. Now they barely moved meters. Once, panzer divisions had spearheaded attacks. Now they were barely mobile pillboxes, trapped in white wastelands they could neither escape nor control. Tank commanders issued a new standing order: never let the engine die. It became the mantra of the winter front. Panzer engines had to run, while crews slept while repairs were made, even during lulls in combat, even during artillery shelling. If the engine stopped, the tank became a coffin. Crew rotation became essential. 2 men slept, while the others kept the engine warm and cleared ice from the air intakes. The constant vibration of an idling engine mixed with the drone of howling wind created a surreal atmosphere inside the tank. Tankers later recalled nights where fuel lines froze, engine parts snapped, hatches iced shut from the outside. Snow drifted over entire tanks, burying them alive. Crews awoke to silence, a silence more terrifying than artillery, because silence meant the engine was dead. And if the engine was dead, the crew's chances of surviving the night were very low. Tank interiors reached temperatures below freezing. Breath condensed into ice on metal surfaces. Machine gun barrels frosted over. Breech blocks stuck, needing kicks just to open. The loader, usually positioned closest to the hull, suffered the most. Many loaders lost conscious control of their hands. Some grew so numb they could not feel the heavy shells they handled. Commanders had to shout, slap, or shake them awake during combat. One report from Panzer Regiment 5 described a terrifying moment. A loader passed out from hypothermia while holding a shell. It slipped from his hands, hit the turret ring, and froze in place because it stuck to the iced-over metal. Such moments were not rare. They were common. Meanwhile, Russian infantry equipped with padded winter gear maneuvered comfortably by comparison. Their breath steamed, but their limbs still worked. Their weapons still fired. And slowly, inevitably, they began to overwhelm the frozen German lines. The Red Army had learned from the summer catastrophe. Now, in winter, they exploited the German weakness with brutal efficiency. They struck immobilized tanks first, frozen silhouettes that could not retreat or relocate. Soviet ski troops, fast and quiet, approached under the cover of night, gliding across open fields where German sentries could barely keep their eyes open. Using grenades, Molotov cocktails, and anti-tank rifles, they destroyed dozens of tanks without ever fighting a mobile enemy. Crews often woke up to explosions, scrambling to open hatches that had frozen shut. Some never made it out. Some died trapped. And some were found sitting upright in their seats, covered in frost, still gripping controls they could no longer operate. German officers began noting with horror, "We feared Soviet shells. Now we fear the cold far more." Soviet commanders recognized this shift and accelerated operation. By January 1942, German engineers began performing what crews grimly called mechanical autopsies on failed tanks. They documented thousands of system failures. Recoil cylinders frozen solid, hydraulic fluids thick as mud, electric wiring snapping like twigs, gun breeches jamming halfway closed, metal tracks cracking at stress points, suspension systems immobilized by ice. Even the simple act of turning a turret sometimes required 3 men instead of 1. The winter noose tightened, the Soviets pressed forward, and German tankers faced a reality more horrifying than battle. Every step backward took them farther from supply lines and deeper into a winter they were never meant to survive. Infantry, artillery, logistics, and armor all suffered. But the tankers had the worst of it, trapped inside frozen shells, engines dying without warning, frostbite claiming fingers, toes, ears, noses, Soviet troops attacking with new confidence. The legendary German armored divisions, once the spearhead of Europe, were now a battered, freezing shadow of their former selves, and yet they continued to fight. Because stopping meant death. The cold was constant, merciless, and unforgiving. But on certain nights, temperatures dropped so rapidly that German tankers swore the air itself cracked. One such night, January 23, 1942, became legend within Panzer Group 3. A sudden freeze hit the front as the temperature plummeted to minus 42 degrees Celsius in under 2 hours. Entire companies that had kept their engines running through the evening watched them sputter, cough, and then fall silent as fuel lines gelled instantly. One tanker recalled, "It felt as though the cold had hands, and it squeezed the life out of every machine." In dozens of tanks, heaters died, radiators seized, steel contracted so violently that some tanks emitted loud metallic snaps that echoed across the frozen. From the tree line north of Kalinin, a Soviet ski battalion advanced, silent, disciplined, and perfectly camouflaged under moonlit snow. These were men who had grown up in temperatures that would kill a German soldier in hours. While German crews fought to revive frozen engines, Soviet scouts signaled forward positions with brief flashes of reflected moonlight. Moments later, the ground shook. T-34s emerged from the forest like dark phantoms. Their engines had been pre-warmed with fires. Their crews wore thick, fur-lined overalls. Their diesel roared confidently in the night air. The contrast was brutal. Soviet tanks, mobile, warm, fully functional German tanks, immobile, silent, freezing tombs. A panzer. 3 crew near the village of Rogachiovo described the horror vividly. "We watched their silhouettes move. We tried to start our engine. Nothing. We were trapped, sitting ducks. And the Soviets knew it." The first shells landed among the German positions. Explosions lit the snow in violent bursts of orange and white. Panzer crews scrambled to return fire, but their turrets moved sluggishly, jammed by ice in the traverse gear. One Panzer IV attempted to rotate its turret. The motor whined, groaned, then snapped. A crewman shouted, "The turret is frozen!" Another tank's main gun would not recoil properly. The hydraulic fluid had thickened. Still, the tankers fought on. The findings were astonishing. Russian winter destroyed more German tanks than Soviet guns did that season. The army tried solving the problem, issuing new lubricants, winter oil mixtures, improvised insulation panels, heated fuel additives, but these came too late and in too little quantity. Tankers kept dying in the cold while waiting for equipment that never arrived. A German Medical Corps report from January noted 100,000 frostbite injuries, thousands of cases requiring amputation. Entire units rendered combat ineffective. Tank crews reporting pain so intense it felt like burning ice. Tankers were especially vulnerable. They sat for long periods without movement. Their clothing was inadequate, and the metal around them pulled heat from their bodies relentlessly. Some tried to warm their hands by touching engine components, only to suffer severe burns on already frostbitten skin. Doctors wrote that frostbite became the silent epidemic of the Eastern Front. Bodies were found near tanks, their fingers black, their faces pale blue, eyes open and frozen. Some froze while standing guard. Others froze while repairing their vehicles. A few froze inside the very tanks they fought from, still in their seats, still gripping levers. By mid-January, many German units had been pushed back dozens of kilometers. Entire panzer battalions reported fewer than 10 operational vehicles. Some crews used machine guns instead of their frozen cannons. Others fired from fixed positions, calculating angles manually. A few resorted to using pistols out of hatches, driven by desperation. But the Soviets swept through with frightening coordination. Ski troops poured grenades onto engine decks. Anti-tank rifles punched holes through immobilized targets. Molotov cocktails shattered across frozen armor plates, flames licking over steel that was cold enough to extinguish fire within seconds. The battlefield became a nightmarish blend of fire and ice. Perhaps the most infamous moment of the winter came from a Panzer 38T near Krukovo. Its crew, 5 men from Bavaria, had kept the engine running for 3 straight days, but during the sudden freeze, the motor died. When the Soviets attacked, the crew tried to escape, but the hatch had frozen shut from the outside. They beat their fists bloody against the metal, kicked with all their strength, used wrenches, helmets, and the hatch never opened. The tank was later found by German relief units, its interior frosted over, the crew still seated upright in their positions, frozen in place. The driver's hands were still on the ignition. It became a symbol of the catastrophe. Not all tanks burned. Some froze with their crews inside boots, nothing. As Soviet infantry closed in, one crewman managed to open the pistol port and fire blindly. But not every story was tragedy. Some tankers refused to surrender to winter. In one battered Panzer IV company, only 2 tanks remained operational. Against them advanced a Soviet column of T-34s moving to encircle a German infantry regiment. The company commander, Hauptmann Werner Kohl, made a decision few would ever understand. He ordered the 2 functioning tanks to attack. The crews warmed their engines with burning rags. They smashed ice from their optics. They manually traversed turrets with iron bars, and they charged. The 2 tanks crawled forward at walking speed, engines groaning, exhaust thick with steam. Soviet scouts spotted them and laughed. 2 frozen relics challenging an entire battalion. But the Germans pressed on. At 400 meters, 1 Panzer IV fired. The recoil was sluggish, the cycle delayed, but the shell struck a T-34's track, immobilizing it. The Soviets returned fire, missing in the whirling snow. The 2nd Panzer IV advanced through ice crusts, firing again and again, its loader working through numb fingers. Amazingly, the Germans bought 15 minutes, long enough for retreating infantry to escape. When Soviet tanks finally hit them, the Panzer IVs burned, but they had achieved the impossible. Frozen tanks had held back winter itself. By late January, supply lines were in ruins. Fuel rationing became severe. Some tank units received only enough fuel to run their engines for 30 minutes. Mechanics wept over frozen engines they could not revive. Officers argued with headquarters for winter gear that never arrived. Drivers traded rations for scraps of felt to wrap around their boots. Crewmen tore insulation from destroyed Soviet vehicles just to line their own jackets. A lieutenant wrote, "We were no longer a panzer division. We were a division of statues." The Soviets continued their offensive relentlessly. And German tankers, once elite mechanized warriors, faced a new identity. Tomb guardians of their own frozen machines. One of the harshest engagements occurred near the Volokolamsk highway. German tank crews, running low on ammunition, fuel, and body heat, attempted to hold a ridgeline overlooking a vital supply road. Temperatures, -39 degrees Celsius, wind, brutal, visibility, low. Panzer crews used crowbars to break ice from gun mantlets. Machine gunners cycled their weapons constantly to prevent freezing. Radio operators sat with earphones pressed against frost-encrusted cloth. The Soviets attacked in waves. Ski troops, T-34 spearheads, artillery firing shells that detonated with muffled thuds in deep snow. Every hour, another tank died, not from enemy fire but from the cold. One after another, engines stopped. Those tanks became armored coffins. Their crews huddled inside, lighting small fires in helmets, risking carbon monoxide poisoning just to stay alive. But the ridge held for 7 hours. 7 hours bought time for thousands of German infantry to retreat. 7 hours of frozen terror, frozen steel, frozen blood. By February, German high command faced a realization as brutal as the wind outside their headquarters. The panzer divisions had been shattered, not by Soviet firepower, but by Russian winter. Entire battalions reported fewer than 3 operational tanks. Crews were skeletal, frostbitten, exhausted beyond comprehension. Tankers who once boasted of blitzkrieg victories now whispered prayers inside frozen hulls. The Eastern Front had revealed the truth. Blitzkrieg was a giant with feet of clay, and winter was the hammer. German technology, doctrine, logistics, and preparation had all collapsed before a force indifferent to bravery or engineering. The Soviets pressed their advantage relentlessly, and yet, despite everything, the cold, the fear, the broken machines, German tankers fought to the very edge of human endurance. They held the line long enough to prevent total collapse, but the cost was staggering. The Eastern Front had demanded a sacrifice not even steel could withstand. When the sun rose after the coldest nights of winter 1941-42, the Eastern Front revealed a sight that haunted survivors for decades. German infantry patrols walking the lines found tanks half buried in snowdrifts, crews slumped over their controls, frozen in place, hatches rimmed with ice, impossible to open,